Yeah, we're back. Boats and Pros. Nick Ireson here.
John Economy. Welcome back,
Uh,
everyone.
yeah, we've got a very, very loose agenda to discuss today. Mostly, we are blowing the cobwebs off it. It's been a little while since we've dropped a pod, as it were, and we're sorry about that. Priorities got a little muddled up, and life got in the way, and the holiday season, and got a whole bag full of excuses over here.
Yeah.
But
Happy holidays, everyone.
yep,
We've gone through Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year.
I know I did. It
Yeah. Did you have a good Christmas?
was good. Family came over, and hung out. The kids opened way more gifts than they needed and screamed and broke stuff. And yeah,
Oh, that's a
you?
good Christmas. Pretty low key. Um, we didn't get them nearly as many presents this year as we did last year, which was very nice.
Yeah, they
Uh,
don't need them. They need to get jobs,
yeah.
especially my 2-year-old. He's really pushing it.
I mean, by three, if they're not working, they're not contributing. So
Yeah.
they can live in the chicken coop, you know?
I threaten that regularly. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics, actually, in fiberglassing and boats, and that is stringers.
What is a stringer?
Well, John, I'm so glad you asked. Stringers are, I think of stringers as like, and I know most of our listeners know this stuff, but we're going to touch on it anyway. We got to lay the foundation for maybe someone who just is totally new to this topic. If you're totally new to the topic, stringers are basically like the skeleton of your boat. They provide the backbone and the ribs, if you will. And basically, they give the structure to the hull so that it can take up to the pounding of the waves and force of the motor and all the rest of it.
Frame of a car?
Yeah. Yep. Frame of a car.
Okay.
Yep. Actually, even cooler than frame of a car, in my opinion, because there's so many different ways that you can go about it depending on what you're trying to achieve. You can go simple, you can go really elaborate, you can go one off. There's ways you can replicate, in production, of course. There's cheaper materials, there's more expensive materials, there's ways of doing it that are more labor intensive but and less on materials, and they give you equally good results. And it's just something that it really stretches your mind a little bit, I think, in the project, because you usually end up doing some creative measuring. You might
Mm-hmm.
find yourself pulling some strings and have a hot glue gun or a plumb bob, I think they call it, the little
Yep.
brass pointy thing, or laser levels. We've gone about it so many different ways. Templating is one of the biggest ways, and
What
plotting
were
lines.
we were using? Like a 12-foot square piece of aluminum on what's his face's boat at 321. Remember?
Oh yeah. On Nickel Dick's boat.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll blurb that out. Yes, to fit the stringer grid to the hull. Yeah, that was a situation where it was a production boat and a R&D style production mold for the stringers, and we had to lay it up, then trim them to fit. And there was a lot of pulling straight lines with a big piece of like 2x3 aluminum tube stock or something,
Yep.
which we since then got a bigger piece of that. I think it was like 20 feet. We cut it down to 16 or so. I think the one we
Yeah.
were using was 12 there.
Probably.
The one we have now is 16. But yeah, that's one of those situations where having a really long straight edge comes in handy. But most people just realistically don't have anything longer than like 8 feet for a straight edge. And that's when you get into pulling strings and things like that. So let's just talk a little bit about the basic options that you're going to have for stringers. The old school stringer method, of course, is some lumber, big old piece of 2x10 or 2x6, or depending on the boat, 2x12, cut down to fit into the hull and tabbed into the hull and then glassed over, and limber holes drilled so that the stringers can all drain down into the bilge, and you would use the same material to make your bulkheads outside and inside of the stringers to connect them together and spread that load outwards.
Well, how would you describe a bulkhead to someone who doesn't quite understand it?
It's basically the part that runs perpendicular to the stringer. So imagine if the stringers are your vertebrae, although instead of like having one like our body has, you typically would have two on a boat. and they would be parallel to each other running bow to stern. And then your bulkheads are going to run port to starboard, and they're going to come off the stringers, basically real similar to ribs, rolls up towards the freeboard side of the boat there. So imagine if the stringers are going north to south, then the bulkheads are going east to west.
Like a ladder.
Sure, like a ladder. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. But they'd be coming outside of the ladder too. They're not just between the stringers.
Okay.
They go out the outside of the stringers too.
Honeycomb. Kind of.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just saying words now at this point.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Yep.
Like I flipped to a random page in the dictionary and it says porcupine. So
that.
I have to figure out how to use porcupine in this podcast. And I will.
And you just did it. I owe John $1 now.
Mm-hmm.
That was a pretty clumsy way to get there, but thank you for taking me through the woods on stringers. The upside to wood, it's a very strong material. It's typically pretty inexpensive to get your hands on, easy to source a lot of the time. Downsides to wood is that, of course, it rots. So you have to imagine that your stringer, especially in places like Florida or warmer environments, you got your wood, then your glass wrapped around it, and then it's down inside the hole, under the deck. And in the sun, it just cooks down there. And any kind of water intrusion, which is going to wick up through the grains in the wood from like not properly sealed limber holes or screw holes, little imperfections in the tabbing that could lead to a little bit of water intrusion. That's all going to get sucked up through the grains of the wood. And then you're going to have that pressure cooker effect with the sun just baking down on it. And over time, it just takes that wood and turns it to mush. Now, I've seen boats that are 20, 30 years old with wood components that are just fine. So I'm not saying that happens every time to every boat. There are a lot of boats that lasted very, very long serviceable lives with wood stringers, wood decks, wood transoms. So we're not here to bag on that stuff. Having said that, with labor rates the way they are and the options that we have available now, it would be fairly hard pushed to get me to do wood stringers unless it was a really specific kind of situation, which we actually have one of those in the shop at the moment, which we'll get to in a little bit. But for the most part, we're using Kusa on stringers if we're going to go for that like wood construction method. Or my preferred method is to use hollow glass stringers that we form in a mold outside of the hole and then cut to shape and tab them in. But I'm bouncing around a little bit. So that's woods. That's the pros and cons of wood. Foam is another option. You'll see guys that are taking sheet foam, 2-inch, 2-pound density polyurethane foam, or some guys will get like that roofing foam that has the paper on kind of either side of it. I've seen people who are using epoxy, just get the pink board foam from like Lowe's or Home Depot or something like that. When you're doing this, all your strength is coming from the glass that you wrap over the foam. So it's literally just providing a shape for you to wrap glass over. So whereas in wood stringers, you might just wrap them with a layer of 1708, or I've seen just layers, I've seen a layer of 1.5 ounces up the sides of wood stringers. And then tabbed with some 1708 or something like that, just in the connection point to the hole. They're more or less just trying to waterproof the wood and attach it. Whereas with a foam stringer, you are creating your own wood structure, so to speak. That's not really a great way to put it, but you're creating your own structure with the glass. The curvature of the glass and the hollow shape that's created underneath it is where your rigidity comes from. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So really, your stringer in that circumstance, providing that you're using enough glass, could be literally anything. It could be cardboard and hot glue and tape. It could be anything that the resin doesn't melt and stays in form long enough for the resin to cure. Could be your stringer form. So that's when you're wrapping over something. That's foam core stringers. You can also use the Vinasil, or I've seen people lay up like Nitacor, and I do not recommend that. I'm actually not even going to get into discussing the potential of using like a honeycomb product as stringers, because I'm not a fan of that stuff really anyway, but definitely not really in that circumstance. Unless you're going for the logic of using it like a foam replacement and you're just going to get it in place long enough to really wrap it up, then sure, if that's what you want to do. Sure.
I mean, maybe some people just have that as the only option, unfortunately.
Yeah, or I mean, let's say that you decided to do your deck with Nitacor for whatever reason, or you got a deal on some, or yeah, if you had it sitting around, sure, you could make it work, but
It's not recommended.
it's not my favorite.
Okay.
Hollow grid style stringers is what I really like, and the best solution that I've come up with to this problem with the boats I've done is I have two 8 foot long, 4 inch wide, 12 inch tall stringer molds, which
Mm-hmm. U-shaped.
they are, yeah. And I've over the years that I've had them, I've laid up over them and I've laid up into them. So I've used them as both a male and a female mold. And I always use polyester resin, and I've never had any issues with it bonding to the aluminum. But we always put a little wax on there first. But you probably could get away with running it with no wax, but that just doesn't make sense. Wax or PVA up the aluminum a little bit. I had a buddy who did some aluminum fabricating in Fort Myers, and he knew someone who had a brake, a sheet metal brake that he could make that U shape with no welding for me. So he
Wow.
just took 2 sheets of aluminum and put that custom bend in them, and then I made the little wood enclosure that they sit in, and they sit on casters, and we roll them around, and we either lay up pieces 8 feet long, just pieces of stock until we have enough to piece together our whole stringer grid and tab it in and tab it all together. Or we'll take those two pieces and put them end on end and lay up 16-foot long stringers so that we can have our bow to stern run be close as possible to complete. Most of the boat sizes that we mess with, 16 feet will get you pretty close to the stringer length, the total stringer length that you need, because that'll do pretty close to a 24-foot boat by the
Yeah.
time you've got the curvature of the hull coming upwards and forwards out of the water and all the rest of it. And we pretty much usually, what was the last layup that we did on those? I think we were using that 24-ounce roving, and we did 3 layers of it.
Yeah.
That came out okay. We mostly were doing that because I had that material. I got it for, I think I might have even gotten it for free.
That the Bonefisher? Or not the Bonefisher, the Backcountry.
Yes, the stringers were for the backcountry. Yes,
Yep.
yes, they were. Yep. So pretty much what you end up doing is you need to figure out where the stringers are supposed to sit in order to be able to cut them. Obviously, you need to know where you want them to be to put them there. So once you figure out where your stringers are going to sit, which is kind of a whole nother discussion. If you're building a boat from scratch, then you hopefully can figure that out without my help as far as each unique individual circumstance. And if you're rebuilding a boat, then you need to take good notes of where the stringers were before you take them out and replicate that. Some guys in center consoles and stuff that want the self-bailing decks, find quite a few guys bringing those stringers up inch and a half to sometimes even 3 inches taller, just so they can put the scuppers through the transom there and just have a self-bailing deck, which is obviously a really nice feature if you can have it. So basically, you need some marks or something that you can follow or some measurements, and then you need to start pulling some strings that are going to represent the top line of the stringers. You can take your reference points from before and hot glue the strings across real tight and make an X pattern, or you can kind of figure out for yourself how you want to do it once you get the idea. But basically, you need to simulate the top plane of the stringers and the bulkheads. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you want the deck's going to sit on top of it. So
Yeah, so the deck, there you go, exactly. So the deck represents a horizontal plane, right? That is going, well, it's going to show everyone how dumb I am here because I don't even really know the proper terminology beyond that because I was stoned in geometry class or trigonometry or whatever ometry it was.
biology.
Biology class. But let's just say it's not going Y, so it's on a Z and the X axis, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so you're going, it's a freaking horizontal plane and you need a level. So all the stringers at any point should be touching the line, right?
Yes.
No matter which way you turn, if it were a straight edge, for example, and you laid it across the top of the stringers, it should touch every point where it would make contact, should make contact. I feel like I'm rambling here.
No, you're good. I mean, is it now? Is there any wiggle room? I know it couldn't be
Yeah,
higher.
it can't go higher, and you actually want to shoot to go a little lower. But that's First of all, a really great question. Such a good question that I'm going to get off on a whole different tangent if we go too far into that. But yes, you definitely, if you have to pick one way or the other, you're better to be a little too low than a little too high. And that's because we have bonding putty. That's going to make up the difference in the gaps, provided that you can shim it to where you want it. So I actually have some pretty good pictures on a write up somewhere I should find for this. But once you've got your stringers in, then you would do final measurements again to make sure your deck's going to set level. And you might have some shims that set on top of the stringers. So when the deck rests in, those shims level it. But then the putty locks it in place once it cures.
Okay.
But basically, the first step that I'm trying to describe here, and I feel like I'm not doing a very good job of it, you need to know the top line, the top plane for the stringers. So once you have that, you can measure downwards to the hull and points. So let's just assume that we've got 16 feet of stringer. Let's just say roughly, and this is pretty close, it's a 24-foot long boat, but the stringers are only 16 feet long down inside the hull from the transom going forward. So we've got a 16-foot long line. Then I typically would go every 12 inches. And if I have a string pulled, you can make a Sharpie line every 12 inches. This is where we start to get into the weeds a little bit because it's such an individual way of doing it. I'm really just trying to get the idea across. But then basically you would take a piece of paper and you would write the numbers 1 through 16 and a line on either side of those numbers. And each number on the left side of that line is the port side stringer, and each number on the right side of that line is the starboard side stringer. Now, of course, hopefully everything's symmetrical and all these numbers are going to be the same on both sides, but this is boats, so it doesn't always work that way, although it should be close. And if you're erring on the side of caution and setting a little low on your stringer, you should be able to make up for any fudging that's needed in your bonding putty gap. But basically,
for both stringers, right? So you have two lines.
You'd have two strings. Yes. Yeah. One string to represent the top line of each stringer.
Yes.
Yeah. And then what you can do to make sure that those strings are level is put crosswise strings.
Okay.
So now you would have 4. You would have 2 going down the boat that represent the stringers, and then 1 going diagonal corner to corner, and 1 going the other way diagonal corner to corner.
At the height you want?
At the same height as the other strings.
Okay.
And in theory, if your strings are touching at all points, then the plane is not twisted.
Okay.
So if you're touching front, back, and your strings where they overlap in the cross and the center is touching also, that's Gucci.
Okay.
If you get that, you've really done something. But you can decide based somewhat on the precision you need in the boat and somewhat however much of a tolerance you built into your measurements, what's acceptable to you for that. But I shoot to get as close as I can, within 1/8 of an inch.
Okay.
And that might land me within 1/4 inch. There's even been times where I might have a gap here and there that's a 1/2 inch, but never too high. That's always a 1/2 inch low. And I know that I'm going to put a big old 1.5 glob tall bead of bonding putty all the way down those stringers, and it's going to squish down to a 1/2 inch at the largest point.
Okay.
So we've given ourselves plenty of wiggle room here when we do that. Basically, once you have your strings representing each stringer and a mark every 12 inches, then you're going to measure downwards to the hull, 90 degrees from your top plane line, straight down to the hull, and take your number. And obviously, at the front, the numbers are going to be smaller, and then it's going to curve down, and then you're going to get to a point about 1/3 of the way back or so where your numbers don't change much, and you just shoot right to the transom. Or sometimes they start getting a little smaller again. But basically, you're just going to plot out that line by measuring in relation to the top line, and you write that down on the paper. Then you go over to your stringer stock and you mark out every 12 inches, and then you copy that line onto it, or you copy the point onto it, and then you take a long flexible straight edge, which we like to use those 8 feet long fiberglass scraps that we get from those test panels that we make. You got to get a little creative if you want a nice long straight edge, bendy but consistent. That's not something that everyone's got sitting around, but you can even just use a 4-foot one and do it in sections. But you basically try to form that straight edge so it's touching every point along the line, then trace it with a Sharpie and cut that thing out. And if with a little luck and some fiberglass gods smiling upon you, that sucker will sit down in there pretty close. Now, with those 4-inch wide hollow stringers that I like to make, they are about 5.5 inches wide or so at the top of the mold, which is the bottom if you flip it over, where it makes contact with the hull is wider than the top of the stringer because it has a little draw to it. And so because they're wide, a lot of the times you end up having to pull four sets of numbers for those because you've got the inside line and the outside line because the hull's curving upwards as it's curving up to the side, as it's curving up to the front. And so you end up with some really custom
Yeah.
stuff there. And you really just have to take your time. And there's another way you can do it if you're not comfortable plotting the line like that. Or you can always plot the line and then cut it out of cardboard and test fit it. Whenever you're doing this creative measuring, for lack of a better term, just because you've taken the time to do the measurement like that doesn't mean that you have to commit those measurements to your expensive material right away. You can take something that's much cheaper than your stringer stock that you just made or your Kusa board or whatever it may be. Shoot, even marine ply is $200 a sheet these days. So before you learn the hard way that you just cut it wrong, test it on something else. Just like when we're spraying or anything else, test panel,
Mm-hmm.
sample patch, test bond, test kick, whatever. Like, give yourself a chance to not waste the expensive materials, especially if this is something you haven't done before. It's been years now. You and I can hop in a boat with some really basic equipment and a notepad and get some pretty darn close measurements, but it wasn't always like that.
Those the white inch pieces strips that I did when I did the granite, remember? For templating?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Get some of those.
Yeah, so that's another way entirely that you could do it. If you wanted to just make templates of your stringers, then you could take a note out of the Granite Guys books, and you basically get template strips, which is like corrugated plastic a lot of the time. They're really hard to find for some reason. If you can find a Granite supply store and they'll sell you templating strips and you've got a hot glue gun, that's a great way to do it. Worst case scenario, you might have to go out and buy some 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch cheap particle board or something and rip it down into 1.5 inch wide strips. But yeah, then you can basically just cut little sections and follow the shape of the hull. And you already, you do the same thing. You pull a string to make your top line. And then you build the template from the top line downwards. So I would suspend that long run under the string all the way down with some supports coming downwards to the hull so that it's not hanging on the string. You can't put any weight on the string, obviously.
Yep.
And then you come in along and build out that bottom line with the curvature to it, and then just put a bunch of gussets and cross supports in it and stuff like that. It's really hard to argue with something that just came out perfect fit from where it needs to go. If you can lay that down on something and trace it and cut it, then that's a great option, especially for someone who doesn't really have like a good ability to mentally picture what they're trying to do when it comes to the measurements or something like that. Like, it's a very nice, simple, hands-on approach to just make a template with a hot glue gun and trace it and cut it and be on your way.
Yeah, time saver.
It's a time saver. Yeah. I do have some methods of tracing and forming templates that I'm not even going to try to describe because I'll just end up going around in circles sounding like a lunatic. But we need to make that YouTube video with the rolling radius pieces and all the offsets.
Yep.
That's something really useful. I think the guys will like. That's basically it. You get your stringers, so those hollow grid style, I guess I left you hanging a little bit. So once you have them made and popped off the mold and cut to shape, now they're sitting in the hole. Obviously, you have to attach them. So we usually do our tabbing with 1708. And we've been tabbing, I think on those 23s, we were doing 2 layers.
Yeah.
2 layers of 1708. We were buying slit rolls that were 6-inch wide sections. And we would go around and just do the same thing. We had a notepad and took a measurement, kind of drew roughly a stringer grid, took a measurement for each piece. Well, you did that. You describe it.
Went through the tape measure, measured from front to back, left to right. And if you think about it, say up at the front, you have the very forward part of the stringer that is touching. Then as you come back, you hit your first bulkhead. So I'm going to measure from the very front of the stringer to right where that bulkhead meets. Since there's going to be, say in that corner, one vertical and another horizontal, you're going to have three pieces that meet in that corner. So you really don't have to go too crazy with the overlap, but still do a little bit. And then I would measure out that one section. I think on the 23 foot, if I'm remembering.
We didn't have verticals in those because we made those off that grid mold.
Yeah. Then it would be 1, 2, 4. Dude, I think it was like 50 individual tabs just for one layer on everything.
Oh yeah, no, it was 100 and something, over 100 and something cuts. I remember for the tabbing over all of that whole grid.
Yeah. I think the first one, the prototype one, like the very first one we did,
Where we built
was,
it off my molds.
yeah, I
Yeah,
think we did over 300 tabs.
yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. We should post some. We'll post some of those pictures to go along with this.
Measure, like I said, from front to once you reach the bulkhead, that's your one measurement. Then that same corner to the outside of the bulkhead. So that'd be 1, 2 for that one section. Then I go in the middle. I'm writing all this down, and I do 2 more because now you're on the inside of both stringers. So you have one inside line on this one and one inside line on this one, and then one to your bulkhead.
Pretty much, I think the gist of what we're getting at here is that in a way that makes sense to you, you list the glass in the order that's going to go in, and you're going to need 2 layers for each section, and you pre-cut it, and we numbered them and rolled them all up, and
Yep.
then we call it waffling. One guy is usually the guy who prepped the glass stays outside the boat. You got a piece of plywood in front of him, a bucket of resin next to him, and the glass all stacked in a way that makes sense to them. This is always John in our circumstance. John takes his own measurements, preps all the glass however he wants. I don't even get involved with it. And we're ready to lay up. He sets up next to the boat, hollers at me. I come over. He waffles them up, which means he unrolls them, wets them out, sticks them together if it's 2 layers. So now I can drop the 2 layers in together in one tab. He hands it into me. Sometimes I got to ask clarification on where it goes. Is it the bulkhead behind me or the stringer next to me or whatever, depending on how he measured it all. But it always flows pretty quick and easy. And I think, what were we tabbing those? Maybe 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah, probably about there.
Two guys could tab the stringer grid into a 23 boat in like 3 hours, pretty much. But if you included your material prep time, that was another easily 3 hours, don't you think?
2, probably.
Yeah, maybe 3 with the measuring and all the.
No, still about 2.
Yeah,
it wasn't bad. 30 minutes to take all the measurements, and then
so 8 hours total of labor to prep the stringers for tabbing and then prep the material and tab them in. Not too bad. And we didn't get the benefit of having done a bunch of those. I think we only ever did like 4 or 5 of them. 4.
Once we got rolling, about there.
Can you think of anything that I missed on the topic here?
Should the stringers be touching the whole way everywhere, or should there be like 1/4 inch gap where it actually doesn't touch the hole and it actually floats and you tab it there?
Yeah, if you can float it and you know that you're going to be able to tab it well, it's a nice option. It's especially important if it's a plug and you're going to make a mold. What John set me up to answer here is basically, especially if you're using plywood, if you cut plywood stringers and you just had a boat that was laid up in the mold, you had just laid up the hole and you just dropped all those plywood stringers into it and let them rest on the hole and then tabbed them all in and let that glass cure. When you pulled that boat out of the mold, you would see the hard points of that wood pulling into the glass hole. Just a little bit to do with the shrinkage of the resin and the way everything kind of cures and tightens up and pulls, and you can get them telegraphing through. So if you wanted to make sure that didn't happen, then you would like shim or float the stringers up off of the whole laminate itself and then tab it in so only those tabs were connecting the stringers to the hole. But really what ends up happening usually when you're using plywood is that it gets bedded down into some kind of like Cavasil mix or a bonding putty mix or something like that. And then tabbed in while that putty's still wet is how I like to do it. Okay. And then usually it's not as much of an issue, but I wouldn't do that on a plug boat that I was going to try to turn into a perfect, plug.
Okay.
Limber holes are always important. If you're using wood, make sure that you seal your limber holes up really well. The way I like to do that is I put PVC pipe inside them. So Imagine that you drill in a hole through the 3/4 plywood with the glass on either side. Maybe it's inch and a eighth, inch and a quarter thick total, something like that. You take a piece of like 1 inch PVC and you cut it to 2 inches long, something like that. And you use a hole saw that lets you slide that PVC in, and you know, basically just put your bonding putty or your epoxy or whatever you're using and glassing with to glass everything else up, and you make a putty with it, add some Cabosil if you have to, and you just install those little pieces of pipe like a bushing basically,
Okay.
so that, because even if you just get in there with plywood and mix up some resin or something and just seal that edge, inevitably over time the grain of that wood's going to open up and it's going to expand just a little bit, even if it's just with seasonal weather changes. It's going to open up and then it's going to start to wick moisture in, and that's the beginning of the end. So putting that pipe through every single limber hole is one thing that you can do if you are, I don't want to say forced to use wood, but if you're choosing to use wood in your stringers for whatever reason, be it price or availability or strong personal beliefs or otherwise, at least seal up your limber holes with PVC.
Where on the stringers do you put the limber holes? Do they have to be at an angle?
I always like my limber holes going downwards through the stringer towards the bilge, and just everything drains inwards. So I usually end up not putting limber holes in a lot of my bulkheads, because instead I'll put a limber hole through the stringer behind every bulkhead section.
Okay.
So water doesn't need to pass through the bulkhead and go back to the next bulkhead section, because instead it's going to go downwards towards the center of the boat and into the bilge.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Because
It's
bulkhead usually has the very bottom part like a hole, right?
well, that's the limber hole.
For the bulkheads.
Yes, if you do
I'm
that.
talking about drilling all the other ones.
Well, what I'm saying is you don't need any limber holes going through bulkheads if it all goes down through the stringer right in front of every bulkhead.
Okay.
So just imagine each section. Let's say that you've got two horizontal or two front to back stringers and three bulkheads on either side. Then in theory, you've got your cavity between the two stringers, and then you've got 1, 2, 3 on either side. 1, 2, 3
Yep.
segments that are going to be made up. So you're going to have three limber holes on each section, and it's going to go right in front of the bulkhead through the stringer. So any water that accumulated in that section is just going to drain through the stringer. And then it'll
Okay.
go to
And
the center
then
of the boat and back to the bilge.
gotcha. Because the bulkhead center doesn't touch the boat, right?
Yeah, it does when we tab them. They do, yeah.
Okay.
And it's really just a personal preference thing, the way I do them that way. It just makes the most sense to me. Sometimes if I'm doing hollow stringers and not filling them with foam or anything, then I don't put my limber hole all the way through both sides of the stringer at the point of each bulkhead. So the stringer in itself is a big long drain tube. So you just put you put the limber hole to let the water into the stringer, and then it just drains all the way back to the transom inside
And
the
then
stringer, and you have one limber hole.
on the inside of the stringer.
Yeah, at the transom. Yep.
Okay.
And then you can also run your rigging through the stringers in that same way if you want to. And if you can actually even incorporate some like 4-inch PVC pipe down into the top of the stringer, so that you can poke in through the deck, put the rigging straight into that, and then it runs all the way back and kicks out into the bilge.
And keeps it waterproof.
And keeps it waterproof or water resistant, yeah, because it's up out of the way. However waterproof your rigging tube is pretty much has to do with how you do the hole on the deck. If you bring that tube up with a flange up 2 or 3 inches out of the deck, then that helps to keep moisture out of it. If your rigging tube is just a hole in the deck that goes down into something and that's at deck level, then you're going to get water in it, which isn't a big deal. Something that you want to keep in mind when you're planning your rigging chases as it goes to stringers and things like that. You never want to run your fuel in the same rigging chase that you run your power. It happens. I'm not saying that if you do it, you're going to die, but it's definitely not something that you want to do intentionally. And, if it's at all avoidable, then go ahead and avoid it. And this is definitely me officially saying don't do that. I'm sure there's plenty of guys that have.
So, how's the houseboat going?
Well, you're asking me like you don't know. we've been really pushing towards the finish line on this 74 or so 23-foot houseboat that we have in the shop. We've redone the stringers and the deck and the transom. We've built a custom outboard bracket with a swim platform on it. We've recored the front deck. We've stripped all the accessories. We've done a bunch of fiberglass repairs. We've glazed a bunch of gouges, taken all the windows out, removed all the sealant, removed all the interior wall panels,
Got to use
the
some of that
headliner panels.
free methyl acrylate we got.
Used a lot of plexus to shore up that inside. It's got like a lot of like 2x1 hardwood studs, for lack of a better term, tabbed all inside the house, and that's what the inside wall panels were brad nailed to, and there was a lot of loosey goosey spots. The boat just does not justify like a full on restoration of gutting all that and replacing all of it, and frankly, it doesn't need it. But there are some areas that needed something.
Yeah, a
So
little spit and super glue.
yeah, we're sitting on a pretty heavy bounty of plexus right now. So if anybody at all out there needs some plexus, please holler at your boy. So we got that all shored up, and we're getting ready to paint the thing pretty soon here, which is going to be a first for us. We're actually doing a Rust-Oleum topside paint job on this boat, which I've been experimenting with a little bit, adding a catalyst hardener to. And so far, I've liked it. You know, it's not all grip, but the age and overall condition of this boat and the overall budget that can be put into the prep time is just not going to let us get it to a yacht finish. And honestly, it's not necessary. It would be silly to do that. With this boat is going to get used by a pretty cool couple. They're in the neighborhood of approaching retirement age in the next 10 or 15 years or something like that, and they're just planning to use this thing on lakes and things like that. And I don't think that they really need it to be super duper high end. They just want it to be clean and presentable and respectable, and look nice from 10 or 15 feet away. So we haven't promised them the moon on this paint job, but we've promised them we're going to do the best we can within reason, and we're going to do some video documenting of that as we go here. And
I'm excited for the jet boat.
yes, yeah, really our motivation on finishing this houseboat, other than just kind of wrapping up the project and of course some pay, is moving on to the jet boat, which we've been just threatening and doing absolutely nothing about for since the beginning of this endeavor here, really.
No, we got a video of us fixing up the mold.
Yeah, and I did make the videos of making the mold insert for the jet tunnel. We've done some stuff, but we need to get the houseboat out so we can build that hull. That motor's been sitting on the shelf by the door, calling to me every day. We got to put a new top end in that motor.
It's time.
It's time. That's about what's been going on here. We're going to really make an effort to get back in the game and get the guest on that we threatened, and get the Facebook group pushing again. If you're not a member, go on Facebook, join Fiberglass and Composites Tips and Tricks, and come say what's up.
What's the other one you got?
Now, the other one is just the Fiberglass and Composites mold marketplace or something. We just don't allow for sale posts in the one group, and people always ask about it. So I just made another group where people can do their for sale posts. But it's funny because the one group has like 124,000 members, and the for sale group has like 123 people or something.
That's all right.
It's growing slowly, but it's not even a comparison to the main group. But yeah, come join us. We'd love to have you and learn what you've got to say. So I think until next time, this is Nick.
This is John.
See you later.
Bye.